I'll be there in just a moment, but we have a show for you to beat all ends today.
Let's
And we'll
jump
be
into
on in a
rotate.
moment. Yes, we are going to jump into an amazing rotation.
Is that like you introduced the show while parallel parking, didn't you?
Yes, in fact, I just did a perfect parallel park.
That is an amazing talent.
Well,
That's what happens when you grow up in Detroit.
This is obviously a great show. I guess, Gary, I'm going to see you with me in just 1 second. But Kano.
Yeah, so let's start out with introductions for folks who might be tuning in for the first time. My name is Christopher Kano. I am our executive director here at Suncoast Normal. I just want to say that I'm honored to just be a part of this organization and having the opportunity to found this chapter of Normal alongside Carlos, who is our amazing engineer, show host, deputy director, Masters of Business Administration, all the accolades and credentials that are well deserved. Carlos, back over to you, brother.
Hey, what's going on?
Okay. Yeah, that is my first parallel park while introducing the show. It was wonderful.
Well, it's you weren't listening, but Kano introduced myself, and I think Gary, you should introduce yourself and our special guest.
Okay. Yes. And I am your political director, Gary Stein, and the Master of Public Health of the group. And the gentleman next to the gramophone, and that is a wonderful Victrola gramophone. Is that authentic?
Yes.
It's beautiful, beautiful.
Is it got a ruby needle?
No, just the metal needles.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't have any 78s to play at this time, but yeah, that attempts have been made to put that on the garage sale table a few times, but it hasn't quite happened.
Yeah, that's an amazing piece, but it pales in comparison to you, sir. We talk a lot of game here, but I can guarantee you that you have far more knowledge about cannabis and its effect on the human body and its biology and its phytochemistry than anybody, I would say, in the country right now. And we are very honored to have Dr. Ethan Russo on our show today.
Oh, whoa, that's the wrong one. Oh, I'm getting really bad at this. There you go. Ethan Russo. Woo!
Sound effects.
I guess one of the first questions I want to ask you is that we have got a lot of different products being developed across the country right now with all the new medical programs, or at least quasi-medical programs across the country right now that are made from isolates. And my question to you is that, can we call an isolate a genuine cannabinoid medicine?
Well, as long as it comes from cannabis and it's used in a medical context, then sure, it fits. I would just maintain that no isolate is good on its own in comparison to more complete extracts of cannabis because of what we call the entourage effect. This is the ability of a botanical medicine, a medicine made from plants, to have multiple components that complement one another, reduce side effects, and produce an overall more therapeutic effect.
I mean, we again at Florida, we have a medical program. At least that's what they call it. You have to have a medical recommendation in order to be able to purchase legally. And yet, when you go into a dispensary, what they call MMTCs over here, you look at the people behind the counter, and they are not pharmacists. My father was a pharmacist. He used to always say that he's the last line of defense to make certain that your medicine is proper.
Sure.
But the bud tenders, they have very little knowledge other than saying, well, this medicine will knock you on your butt, which is not exactly what people are looking for. You're looking for some kind of relief from a particular condition. How can we
What's the
resolve it?
problem? Yeah, I mean, again, it's situational, but it's true to say that most haven't had proper training, particularly to give advice, not only about different chemovars, chemical varieties of cannabis, but particularly about their therapeutic effects. However, this is exacerbated by a bunch of misconceptions by the public. To give an example, my son was voted runner-up for best budtender in Seattle some years ago. He would try to advise consumers that the first thing he'd ask for would be the highest THC available. He would try to disabuse them of the notion that that was what they wanted. Rather, it should be about the experience or the effect or therapeutic benefit that they were trying to gain. And that might come from something else that wasn't the highest THC. And you'd go through this speech, and then people would ask for the highest THC material. In a recent study I was part of, BitPlayer on 80 Poe published an article, The Nose Knows, on basically pointed out from data taken from the Cultivation Classic in Portland, Oregon, that showed that consumer preference when they'd actually tried material and when they were blinded to what it was supposed to be, that it wasn't based on THC concentration. It was rather based on effects and particularly influenced by the terpenoids, the aromatic components of cannabis. So, I would hope that this kind of information would really make people examine their choices a little more carefully.
Now we've got a number of dispensaries here that create their own products basically in the lab. We like to call it hot dog water because it kind of tastes like the product, but it's not exactly the product. They had a legendary chemovar here in the state of Florida, Gainesville Green, that I think we lost the genetics a long time ago, but they were claiming that they had that actual product once again. And what they were doing is that they were guessing as to what the possible terpene profile was and how much of the various cannabinoids were there, and they threw them together into an oil and said, "There you go, you've got Gainesville Green." But that really isn't the case, is it?
Highly unlikely.
Dr. Russo, when you hear something like that, I'd imagine as somebody that who's worked so hard to inform the public and study this plant, you have to take some offense to that, don't you? Like, does that at least break your heart just a little bit to hear that this plant is approached so irresponsibly in some cases?
You must have a high frustration tolerance. Yeah, we've been dealing with this political nonsense for decades.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember how in the 1970s we were close to decriminalization of cannabis, and it didn't happen. And we didn't take 2 steps back under Reagan, but more like 200 steps back.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still trying to recover from that.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're still trying to recover from the Schaefer report. So,
right.
That's basically where it comes from. And the Schaefer report actually did say that cannabis should not be an offense, but merely should be contraband in public.
Yeah, and freely available medically. So even then, where they knew far, far less than we do now, they recognized that fact. And it was a good report. There actually were scientists involved, but as usual, politics got in the way. And for people who don't know, this is a commission that was put together to properly schedule cannabis, which had arbitrarily been placed in Schedule 1 as a forbidden drug under the Controlled Substances Act. But it stayed there because Nixon rejected the Schaefer Commission findings even before he read it. So that was the kind of guy he was.
Well, Dr. Russo, you mentioned about politics and how it plays a role in the continued prohibition. As a Schedule 1 drug, according to Congress, cannabis has no accepted medical value. But obviously, a scientist like yourself, who's been on the cutting edge of this research, knows better. And I've seen, back in the late '90s, at the turn of the century, you applied for the ability to study cannabis and its treatment of migraines, and they shut it down. What is it politically that needs to change? Do we need a presidential administration that's going to put the right bureaucrats in office so that the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Drug Abuse aren't continuing to shut down researchers like yourself, or is it really a legislative fix where Congress has to do the rescheduling? Because we see this back and forth between presidential administrations and Congress as to who actually needs to make the change.
Is right bureaucrats actually an oxymoron?
Yeah, probably. Well, we need a lot of changes. It's an odd thing when I'm probably too young to be a senator because the average age, I believe, is greater than mine. But no, the real necessity here is for physicians and scientists to at least assist in the rulemaking process rather than it being decided by politicians who are both biased and largely ignorant.
Now, of course, you've heard that the recommendation from HUD, that kind of the Health and Human Services, that kind of snuck out, was that they were planning on rescheduling to 3. And do you see that as a positive or a negative move?
Well, it's a mixed bag. On the plus side, if it were done, it would mean that a thing called 280E that prohibits banking and the ability of cannabis companies to run as a business, that might be possible. However, I don't see this as a solution at all. First of all, it doesn't fit. Schedule 3 is designed to cover drugs that are FDA approved that need some measure of control, but not as tightly as Schedule 2 with drugs like the amphetamines that have limited prescription ability, or Schedule 1 where they're forbidden totally, except in government sponsored or government approved research. I shouldn't say sponsored. So no, I mean, it really doesn't fit in a schedule, and it should be descheduled and regulated. Something like alcohol, it doesn't need to be exactly like alcohol. But there's something very unequal, let's say, about a situation where cigarettes that actually are addictive and kill people, they're legal without a lot of regulation aside from heavy taxation, and cannabis remains as a Schedule 1 drug. That's crazy.
I actually had a chance to meet Dr. Dahl, who did the initial studies back in the 1940s that linked tobacco to cancer. I think it was bladder cancer at that point in time. And he was shunned by the medical community because cigarettes were a commodity at that point in time, just like alcohol is a commodity. And that really did play a part in them actually listening to the science. Do you see as a continuing problem with cannabis right now that basically it's the zeitgeist, the gestalt that prevents the science from getting through?
Sure. Well, I've been waiting a long time for sanity to take hold. It hasn't happened yet. So no, yeah, we're still waiting.
Well, Dr. Russo, I want to hear I want to get a little personal. I guess I want to say, like, I wonder why you're so passionate about the plant. What was it about this plant that made you want to study it so much?
Well, I've known about this plant for a long time, but it really happened in the mid 90s after I came back from a sabbatical in the rainforest in Peru, working with the Machigenga tribe. I knew I wanted to try to transition my career into study research and development in medicinal plants. So then it was 1996. Prop 215 in California was coming about. And I got in touch with Rick Doblin at MAPS, in relation to wanting to do research on Schedule 1 drugs. And at that time, it wasn't just cannabis, it was also the psychedelics, which are gaining some traction now, finally. But he quickly enlisted me to be a sort of sacrificial lamb on the research effort front. It was the same time that Donald Abrams was trying to investigate whether cannabis might be harmful in HIV. So the fact that he was looking at possible side effects allowed him to get access to cannabis and showed that, in fact, it wasn't harmful. On the other hand, I was trying to study therapeutic effects of cannabis in migraine, and they weren't going to allow that. So when the premise was benefit from cannabis, it just didn't fly with the powers that be at the National Institute of Drug Abuse. In 1999, in my third year of these efforts, I actually had the Food and Drug Administration approve my request to do this kind of study, but then NIDA would not supply it, and they had a stranglehold on the legal supply of cannabis for research, which still remains in effect. It's still extremely difficult to study real-world cannabis from non-governmental sources. So we're not that different with the situation than we were back in the 90s.
I had a chance to try some of Herb Rosenfeld's government cannabis, and I wasn't impressed. Maybe it's the Mississippi soil. Maybe it was the fact that they freeze-dried it, let it grow mold all over it.
It's everything. It was the genetics, the cultural conditions, long-term storage. No, that whole program was one that was designed to fail, and in that it succeeded quite well.
That's a good point.
like I don't have very many specifics in mind, but that seems to be a trend. I mean, you said earlier that like in order to get a study done in cannabis, you had to have the intention of finding something negative about it. But it seems like most of these studies showed up like, oh, there's nothing negative, and then they like shut it the fuck down.
Yeah,
I mean, basically, right?
And,
Sure.
and how many studies were done with cannabinoid analogs, since they couldn't actually get in contact with the actual plant?
Well, on the research front, that's often the case. I mean, it still happens at scientific meetings that someone will do research in rats with a synthetic cannabinoid and claim that it has something to do with cannabis usage in humans, and that's nuts. So, it's gotten to the point where someone will always ask, well, if you were wanting to show a deleterious effect in humans, why didn't you use THC, or why didn't you test in humans? And usually there isn't an answer aside from, well, that's what we were allowed in the grant. So yeah, it really has been a very skewed situation with respect to funding of research.
Now, you helped doing the research for Epidiolex, correct? With
Correct.
GW Pharmaceuticals. Now, I keep on thinking about how much they were continuing to push Marinol for a long time as the option if you could not get cannabis, as if you actually needed one, since they didn't say they had any medical use anyway. But we had this one lady here in Florida, Kathy Jordan, who has had ALS since 1986. And when she came to Florida, she told them, this is what saved me. This is why I've had this disease for 15 years and I'm still alive at that point in time. And now she's just turning 70. And they said, well, all we can do is get you a prescription for Marinol. And that to me was the big red flag that, can the pharmaceutical industry actually embrace this drug properly? I mean, they tried doing it at the turn of the century, and they couldn't get a consistent medication. And
well, yeah,
and now they're trying single molecules.
Sure. To put it in context, so people know, Marinol is a synthetic form of THC that was approved by the FDA in 1985 to treat nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy for cancer. This was the government's solution to the idea of cannabis as medicine. However, Marinol has never really taken hold. either with the medical community or certainly with patients. Anyone who's tried Marinol and has tried cannabis realizes that they're very, very different things. THC has many therapeutic effects, but on its own, it's a lousy drug and it's very poorly tolerated and has more side effects for most people than benefits, and very few people remain on it on a regular basis. There have always been issues with how do you make a FDA-approved pharmaceutical from a botanical, meaning a plant-based drug, but it's been done twice now by my former company, GW Pharmaceuticals. You mentioned Epidiolex. For context, that is an extract from cannabis that's about 97% CBD with a smattering of other components. It's FDA approved in this country to treat Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and seizures associated with tuberous sclerosis. There's another medicine not approved here, but in 30 other countries called Sativex, that is, again, 2 extracts combined, one from a high THC plant and another from a high CBD plant. Again, although that's not approved here, it was because the trials in cancer pain worked in the Americans, but not in the Eastern European cohort that was much sicker. However, it did pass the safety and consistency aspects. There's a thing at the FDA called Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Control, CMC, wherein you have to demonstrate that your medicine derived from the plant is extremely consistent over time. And this was. So that wasn't the stumbling block. It was the fact that certain patients were too far along in their illness with cancer to gain an observable benefit.
Yeah, I know that oftentimes it's difficult to decide if a cancer treatment is appropriate, because most time they don't know where the starting point of the cannabis was. When you're talking about a 5-year survivor, you don't know if a person has already had it for 1 or 2 or 3 years and undetectable at that point in time. So obviously it's difficult.
Sure. Well, there are 2 things to consider here in use of cannabis in the context of cancer. One is treating the symptoms. It's well established that cannabis is very helpful in treating chemotherapy-associated nausea and can benefit appetite in what is usually a wasting disease associated with cancer. It certainly has shown benefit in treating pain associated with cancer, sleep disturbance associated with cancer. Then the real issue becomes primary treatment of cancer. In other words, can we use cannabis to actually kill the tumor? Back in the 70s, it was demonstrated that in lung tumor cell line, that THC killed the cells. However, this was really suppressed and not much was done with it for about another 25 years when research began anew. And it turns out that various cannabinoids in cannabis exert specific anti-cancer effects on various types of cancer cells. What's really interesting is that the different cannabinoids work on different mechanisms. And it's also been demonstrated that they can produce synergy, that when you have more than one in combination, that they produce a boosting effect. This is also true when they're combined with conventional chemotherapy. However, this hasn't resulted in a drug as yet, although work continues. And I could mention I'm the chief medical officer for a company called Andira, Andira Pharmaceuticals in Canada, that is researching how to deliver cannabinoids in a concentrated form that go preferentially to the tumors rather than more generally. And this uses what are called lipid nanoparticles. So that's a very promising technology to apply to this, and hopefully we'll see regulatory approval someday.
And I know that the the people who could not get into the state-regulated medical programs as cultivators and producers have seen another option in regards to these hemp-derived cannabinoids, as in the Delta 8, Delta 9, and the THC flower and things of that sort. I'm curious as to what your take is on these products. Obviously, they can't be consistent because there's no consistent production.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be. It's just that the right techniques haven't been applied. So that people understand, in 2018, the agriculture bill was passed that redefined hemp as material that had less than 0.3% THC content. So this really led to an explosion of cannabidiol CBD usage, but it created new problems as well. Basically, there became a glut of CBD, the price plummeted, and people needed a new way to make money. Then the myth arose that if you could transmogrify the CBD into Delta 8 THC, that would be legal. However, despite the fact that Delta 8 THC can be found in trace amounts in natural cannabis, none of the Delta 8 products that we see throughout the landscape are really derived from the plant. Rather, they're synthesized from CBD and are never pure. They're always associated with contaminants that include things that we haven't been studied or can't even identify. And a lot of them have residual solvents, etc. But again, I blame the government for all of this. Number one, the law was weird and hasn't been properly interpreted. Number two, this development is basically a byproduct of prohibition. So it's the same. It was the same thing in alcohol prohibition. In alcohol prohibition in this country, although some beer was made, really bathtub gin and other distilled products were what were typically available. And the reason for that was, if you've got a whole clandestine contraband, it might as well be concentrated. And the same things happen here. We've seen this profusion of Delta 8 products and synthetic cannabinoids, K2, spice, et al. And none of this would exist if cannabis were legalized and properly regulated.
For real, I wouldn't own a hemp company if I was able to sell cannabis. Said that plenty of times before.
Yeah. Well, Doc, I wanted to get your 2 cents on, the intersection of, medical cannabis research and prohibition with the prison industrial complex. One of the things that I see is the DSM-5 still considering marijuana addiction like an actual major problem, and I'm just curious to see, where does this make sense? I mean, you've been on the research of this. Can we put away that the myth that cannabis is addictive, or is it people who have addictive personalities using the drug as a crutch? Carlos and I often go back and forth about this. It's not the plant, it's the person. Just like in many ways, when you see pit bulls get a bad rap, it's typically bad owners, not the dog.
Okay, well, this is going to be a few paragraph explanation. Is cannabis addictive? The answer is yes, it can be in certain susceptible individuals. However, it, as an addictive drug, appeals in comparison with almost anything else you could name, including caffeine and nicotine. So cannabis withdrawal, when it occurs, will lead to intense dreams, some sleeplessness, appetite changes, irritability. No one dies. No one sees pink elephants, and it's gone in a few days if it's happened at all. I've been with 10-gram a day smokers of high quality material when they were traveling and didn't have access. And again, I heard a few complaints, but I saw no visible symptoms. there are people who are addicted to cannabis, but the figures are skewed. And this is, again, politically motivated. The conventional figure is that 9% of people who try cannabis will become dependent upon it. However, that is erroneous because 60% of people who end up in treatment for cannabis addiction are there because of they've been sent there by the judicial system as a substitute for incarceration. As you know, in a 12-step program, you don't pass unless you declare yourself at the mercy of the substance and over which you have no control, and otherwise adhere to the quasi-religious dictates of the 12-step program. Now, this is not to say that cannabis lacks any side effects. Certainly it does, and anybody who says differently is lying to you. And there are certain people who shouldn't use cannabis, but it's a short list compared to other substances. It's really not advisable for someone who is young, and certainly if they have a first-degree relative with schizophrenia, it places them at some risk. Additionally, a small subset of people who use cannabis will have a thing called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And people who have this find that, they develop a very severe problem with nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and hot water bathing behavior. Eventually, they may get diagnosed, if they're lucky, after they've spent tens of thousands of dollars on ER visits and tests. But sooner or later, someone will tell them that they have to stop using cannabis, that cannabis is causing this reaction in this subset of people. However, invariably, these folks return to cannabis usage and set off another round of attacks with those symptoms. Right now, our advice to people who have CHS is that you need to abstain from cannabis usage because it's demonstrably related to THC or other cannabinoids that stimulate the CB1 receptor. And there's, I think you have it in the chat, a link to my articles at ethanrusso.org at the library tab. There's a couple of articles there on cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome if people are interested in reading about that.
I appreciate that, Doc, because these type of situations are often utilized by prohibitionists when testifying in front of state legislatures, testifying in front of Congress as reasons to pump the brakes, as reasons to continue the status quo. Anecdotally, every time I've had something that could be considered CHS, it's typically been related to having a poor diet, but before consuming really high quality amounts of THC. I wonder what role that might play if we ever got the opportunity to actually research CHS in a laboratory.
Chris
setting.
likes a lot of was it raw calamari? Is it?
No, I would say is the poor diet of a 20-year-old millennial back in the 2000s of Taco Bell and Burger King.
It can be a factor. It does turn out in our communications with folks with CHS, many of them have very questionable lifestyles and have a tendency towards other addiction, poor diets, etc. Let me clarify something. Anyone who's exposed to too high a level of THC, even at a given moment, can develop nausea and vomiting. This is due to something that requires a little explanation. It's called a biphasic dose response curve. Let's break that down. So it's common knowledge that at low doses, THC or cannabis reduces nausea, particularly associated with chemotherapy. However, cannabinoids can have opposite effects if the dose is too high. And so when people overdose, on THC, like with a vape or concentrate, they may get sick rather than having the nausea reduced. So it's something to keep in mind. And this can happen to anyone, and it doesn't mean that they either have cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome or will have it. It is a signal. Their body is telling them to take it easy, probably use less or preferably a less concentrated form of cannabis.
And that is one of the reasons why a lot of legislatures have put through laws like we have here in Florida that you can be arrested as a felony for having less than a half gram of concentrate. Well, I mean, we have a constantly here, they say, oh, we're just following the science. But unfortunately, the scientists are talking about is Dr. Bertha Madras. And lady from Harvard who constantly thinks that THC psychosis is a major problem in this country. So that's what we're dealing with.
Well, Gary, it's ironic you say that because THC psychosis was what Anslinger utilized in the Victor Licata case, which happens to be down the street from the studio right now in Ybor City. So Dr. Russo, after 80 years of misinformation coming from our government, I mean, you are one of the leading minds on this. Does cannabis make people crazy and kill their parents, as the government originally asserted in the 30s?
The answer is no. I mean, usually cannabis is associated with peace and love, not murder. But to put it in context, there are a lot of people that get arrested for this or that, and they may have methamphetamine and heroin, and they have cannabis, and somehow it gets blamed. But this has been carefully studied. Here is what we understand. There are certain people who cannabis does not create psychosis where there was not a previous predilection, meaning that there's certain people who are at risk. Keep in mind that schizophrenia is a common disorder. It affects 1% of the general population, no matter where you are. But people who are susceptible, if they smoke cannabis, particularly at a younger age, may develop the full-blown disorder earlier than they would otherwise. That is true. But again, it will occur with someone who is susceptible. Now, in context, too much cannabis can make people temporarily crazy, meaning a few hours, with what's called a toxic psychosis. Now, it sounds terrible, but this is a self-limited condition, meaning that if somebody has too much cannabis and gets delusional and paranoid and ends up in the ER, they can either be talked down or given a mild sedative, and in a few hours, it will pass. And there should be no remaining lingering effects aside from a big hospital bill and scaring a lot of people. Again, this isn't for everybody. If that person had a first-degree relative that had schizophrenia, they need to avoid it. But again, another piece of evidence, if we look at the prevalence of schizophrenia in the 1960s as compared to now, it's the same, actually a little bit less, and there are other environmental factors that lead to that. If we compare the prevalence of cannabis usage in the early 60s compared to now, it skyrocketed. Over half of the US population has used or uses cannabis. And with the figures for schizophrenia actually being stable or having gone down, that would not be possible if it were the cause. It is not.
That's a great point.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah. Another issue that a lot of people are having in the modern era, because as you said, there is more access to cannabis, is pets getting into it. So what's your 2 cents on that? Do you spend the $5,000 at the ER for them to tell you your dog is just high and let them ride it out, or do you let them ride it out at home and save yourself a hospital?
Well, again, this is the owner's fault, but the same thing happens with kids.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Is like,
Sure.
what about these kids? You know,
Yeah, I mean,
you
it's a
hear
legitimate
about
concern.
all these calls going into hospitals and Center for Disease Control, but you never hear about what happens after the phone call.
Right.
So,
Well,
yeah,
didn't Ed O'Shaughnessy do a lot of animal studies?
I'm sorry.
Didn't Ed O'Shaughnessy do a lot of animal studies in his initial studies in Bangladesh in regards to cannabis use?
Right. But going back to the other issue, people have to be responsible with their drug use, and that means
Yeah.
storing it where it's away from the kids and the dogs. Um, yes. So William O'Shaughnessy was an Irish physician. In the late 1830s, he went to Calcutta in the service of the British Crown. He studied what the Ayurvedic physicians were doing with cannabis. He gave it to various animals, and then he gave it to people. And this was the primary impetus to the uh, let's say, reintroduction of cannabis as medicine to Europe and North America. And from there, it became a mainstream, frequently prescribed drug in both Europe and the US until its prohibition. So people are not usually aware of that fact.
I'm sure that was a problem with Britain since they happened to be high into the opium trade in the late 1800s. As
Yeah,
opposed
we could
to
go on
cannabis.
about the sins of the empire, but
so Dr. Russo, what typically happens when say you know, I don't have kids, but say I take my son into the ER and I'm like, oh my God, he just ate my weed brownie, right? What would the doctor do?
oh, it really depends. They might try to, quote, pump his stomach, unquote. Hopefully, they would just offer quiet reassurance and support. It might be necessary to give intravenous fluids if vomiting's involved. You know, overdoses in kids can be really serious and certainly are very scary, and it just shouldn't happen. And prevention is the only issue. It's not a legitimate reason to perpetuate prohibition.
Uh,
People
it-
are always going to do stupid things. You can't legislate intelligence.
I mean, in adults, to possibly temper the possibility of toxic THC issues, is it better to have a ratio effect to have a CBD 1-to-1 to THC in order to modify the effects of the THC as an
Yeah.
entourage effect?
So, you know, this is a situation where, again, we implicate what's called the entourage effect, the ability of other components of cannabis to reduce the side effect profile of THC. So CBD is very good in that regard. And it's a myth that CBD is necessarily a so-called buzzkill, unquote. There was a situation some years ago, material that was bred by my colleague, Mark Lewis. It was in his material was in one of the contests. It was this was basically a 1-to-1 mixture of THC and CBD with other components, of course. But it was winning the popularity contest before they figured out it was in the wrong category because it was going head to head with THC only chemovars. So it really depends on the total composition, but it is absolutely clear that CBD and other components of cannabis make it a better medicine and better tolerated agent.
I mean, the other cannabinoids are also important too. I've noticed that my wife, who has a problem with glaucoma, when she has a chemovar with a high amount of cannabidiol, CBG, that seems to work better for her to reduce that the intraocular pressure that sometimes can just totally flip her out.
Right. So cannabidiol or CBG also lowers intraocular pressure in a manner similar to THC. It also has the benefit of being a very effective anti-anxiety agent without being sedating or addictive.
I got it.
You know, Doc.
Go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Dana.
Okay. Well, you know, Carlos, I promise we'll go to you after this. But one of the things that we talked about just recently was kids and what happened in the ER. What the one part that was left out is, if that happens to you, oftentimes it will trigger an investigation by Child Protective Services, and you could possibly lose your kids over it. That has also been translated into policies in certain states to penalize pregnant women for utilizing it. And for anybody who has had a rough first or second trimester, the nausea, the vomiting, and the applications of cannabinoids to help, is there deleterious effects on fetal development in regards to cannabis? Is this something that we need to study further, or is the studies that have already been done adequate scientific literature?
Whew. Okay, first, let's preface this by saying that no one should attempt to depict that Ethan Russo said it was okay for women to smoke cannabis when they're pregnant. Okay? Is that clear to everyone?
Yeah, that box is checked.
Okay. So, historically, cannabis was used extensively in treatment of obstetrics and gynecological conditions right through the 1930s, including the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association recommended it as an agent to aid in delivery of children. And this was consistent with the historical record, although he may not have been aware of it. It has been well documented that cannabis is extremely effective in treating morning sickness and its more severe form of hyperemesis gravidarum, which frequently leads to hospitalizations and sometimes miscarriage and sometimes death of the mother. Princess Kate had this condition, if people recall. Now, on the other score, what damage is there from cannabis usage? There have been old studies that purported to show low birth weight in babies born to mothers who use cannabis in pregnancy. However, when controlling for other factors, cigarette use, alcohol use, poor diet, poor socioeconomic status, this doesn't hold up. It is definitely the case that cannabis has not been demonstrated to be teratogenic. In other words, producing birth defects the way thalidomide does. So it is true to say that many women who have problematic pregnancies due to nausea or other symptoms use cannabis to advantage. I'm not recommending smoking for anyone. However, there are other forms that could be utilized. And if the question were simply, is there a therapeutic role for cannabis in conditions of pregnancy? The answer is yes. It always has been the case, and it should be in the future, but this remains a forbidden territory. And to repeat, Dr. Russo did not say that it's perfectly fine for women to smoke cannabis while pregnant.
Well, can the pharmaceutical industry create single molecule therapeutics from cannabis that can attack certain syndromes and infirmities, or does there need to be other products from the plant to create the entourage effect?
Yeah. Well, the answer is yes, they can. It doesn't mean that I think it's going to be helpful, not compared to properly constituted cannabis-derived preparations. But again, anything that goes through the FDA process has to show safety, efficacy, and consistency. But again, because of the aforementioned entourage effect, it's my firm belief that cannabis extracts or whole cannabis preparations are superior in their therapeutic effect and safety as compared to isolates on their own. Now, it is possible to use to isolate components of cannabis and combine them in a way that would pass muster with the regulators. In other words, get FDA approval. Excuse me, that would be legitimate. But again, single molecules, and there are various companies trying to create cannabidiol preparations that are somehow delivered in a new way, and they might show benefit, but I think that their benefits would pale in comparison, again, to cannabis extracts.
Dr. Russo, I just want to let you know that if I ever get pregnant, I'm going to quit smoking, okay?
That'd be good. It'd
No,
also be
no,
reported.
it really struck me earlier when you said that your son was a bud tender, and I just like through this entire experience, hearing you talk about cannabis and all this great insight you have about the plant. I'm sure your son shares a similar passion. Hearing that he's a bud tender, I'm wondering, like, what the process would be going to see your son, like what, like as someone that's treating people, like your son treating people with cannabis, what would his process be to, like, you walk in and you start talking to your son, how does he figure out the best bud for the patient?
Well, he didn't offer advice. He tried to direct people more towards effects. Plus, I have to be honest that he became disenchanted with the industry in which he was very well versed and is pursuing other work at this time. So, sad story, often repeated.
So the good bud tenders have been muscled out of the industry. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my oldest daughter suffers from severe migraines, and when she starts getting that halo, that aura, she knows that she's gone for the next 2 days essentially, and yet she found that the nasal spray of THC would actually work to prevent that aura from becoming a full blown migraine. And she went into one of the stores. I'm not going to say who truly, and they didn't have the product that she looked for. And she asked them, well, what do you have that's comparable that will help take care of my migraine because I know it's coming? And they said, well, this will knock you out. This will get you high. This will make you feel really good. And she got down on her knees like in the movie Platoon and said, isn't anybody smarter than me in this room? Because she came there looking for relief and found nobody in that room who knew what to do.
Well, again, I can't fault the folks there. They just don't have the requisite knowledge to deal with this issue. But again, she wouldn't be in this unenviable position if we were allowed to apply what we know and supply real cannabis-based medicines to patients in need. Yeah, and if people were wondering about the history of cannabis and migraine, this has been known for at least 1,200 years. And it was probably the number one indication for cannabis in the 19th century in this country as well as Europe. And it was extremely effective in a way that almost no other medicine is, in that it is useful acutely at the first onset of headache and also as a preventive. Yeah, I've written extensively about this.
Awesome. Well, Doc, my last question for you is real simple. If I was ever in a position to be president of the United States, would you accept an appointment as the Surgeon General or head of the NIDA? Which, well, your pick, but you clearly got a pulse to real science, and we love your desire to actually want to heal people rather than just turn a profit and make a buck for multi-billion-dollar corporations.
Well, thanks for the pseudo appointment, but it ain't going to happen.
You got a good head on your shoulders.
I mean, they had some good choices back in the 80s. I was going to Johns Hopkins. I met Jocelyn Elders, and she was in favor of cannabis as a use of medicine.
Right.
Well,
not so much Coop.
Well, Dr. Russo, I think,
in the words of Will Ferrell, though, Gary, I used to smoke weed with Johnny Hopkins. Him and Sloan Kettering were burning that shit up every day.
Well, Dr. Russo, there's one last thing that we'd like to do here. First off, thank you for coming today. And second, why don't you take a moment and go ahead and look into the camera, tell people how they can support you and where they can find you.
Well, I think it's been put in the chat. My company's name is CReDO Science. The website is available. It looks like we got 3 T's instead of 2. unless I'm looking at it wrong. And then ethanrusso.org at the library tab. My articles are there. Those are available free for download. It's my private website, so nobody needs to worry about copyright infringements.
Okay, wonderful. Thank
Oh,
you.
and nice loot, by the way.
Turkish oud. So
Oh,
that's
oud.
the parent of the European lute, the guitar, and the mandolin.
So it's made out of ash wood.
Yeah, I think that it's an unfinished ash top, I think is what's traditional.
Okay, well,
Nice,
wonderful.
very
Well,
nice.
great show, everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll take your science and your knowledge, and we'll move it forward in our legislations and our policy.
Yeah. And before we wrap, Carlos, we just got to pay the bills real quick. Look, folks, thank you for tuning into the rotation. Thank you to Dr. Russo for being an amazing guest. But we cannot do this without you, the grassroots movement of activists and volunteers. So if you're not already a member of Suncoast Normal, become a member today. Your $25 in membership dues annually goes a long way to what everything we're trying to accomplish legislatively. The mission in Florida is not done. People are still fired from their jobs for being medical cannabis patients. So we have an employment protection bill to address that. People are still being kicked off the organ transplant list and having to make major medical decisions rather than utilizing cannabis to live a healthy lifestyle. And we have a patient protection bill to address that. Medical patients still don't have the right to grow their own medicine at home for themselves and develop the right chemovars and cultivars that are right for them. And so we have a bill to address that. Parents are still having the medical cannabis status used against them in court and to have their kids taken away. We have a parental rights bill to protect that. And new this year, something that we're in the process of working on and drafting right now is the codify and protect your Second Amendment rights as a medical marijuana patient in the state of Florida. So we have a very robust legislative program this year that we're going to be fighting for, and we need you, the people, to join us in this movement. And if you can't become a member, you can also attend one of our amazing events. And one in particular that we're having is one of our largest fundraisers of the year, and that is Halloween 2023 this Friday, happening at Chillum St. Pete. So you can join us. Tickets are available right now. Go to our website, Suncoast Normal. If you want to skip the line, get your VIP ticket. Also, with the VIP tickets come a 1-year membership to Suncoast Normal. So if you just want to go ahead and become a VIP, you can get your membership taken care of all together. And back to you guys in the studio.
And I don't know, you got anything to say, Gary?
Follow the science, but the right science.
All right.